The morning of March 14, 2023, dawned cold and gray over Huntsville, Alabama. A light mist hung in the air as unmarked police vehicles pulled up quietly outside a modest ranch-style home on Weatherly Road. The neighborhood, with its neat lawns and American flags hanging from front porches, seemed frozen in time, much like the case that had haunted this community for 45 years. Inside one of those vehicles sat Detective Sarah Brennan, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel. At 52 years old, she had spent the last 3 years of her career consumed by a case that began before she was even born. The manila folder on her lap contained documents that would finally bring closure to a mystery that had defined Huntsville's darkest chapter. But as she stared at the house before her, she couldn't shake the unsettling truth. Sometimes the monsters we fear are hiding in plain sight, wearing familiar faces we've trusted all along. The arrest warrant in her hand bore a name that would send shockwaves through this tight-knit community, a name everyone knew, a name associated with charity work, Little League coaching, and Sunday church services. But before we understand how this moment came to be, we must travel back to where it all began, to a sweltering summer evening in 1978, when a young woman's disappearance would become the town's most enduring nightmare. June 23, 1978. The temperature had climbed to 94 degrees by late afternoon, the kind of oppressive southern heat that makes the air feel thick enough to swim through. Huntsville was a city in transition, its sleepy farming roots giving way to aerospace dreams as NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center continued expanding, bringing engineers, scientists, and young families seeking opportunity in the space capital of the South. 23-year-old Jennifer Hayes was one of those dreamers. She had moved to Huntsville just 8 months earlier from a small town in Mississippi, drawn by a secretarial position at one of the aerospace contractors supporting the space program. Jennifer was everything you'd expect from a young woman chasing her future in 1978. Optimistic, hardworking, with shoulder-length auburn hair she wore in the feathered style popular that year. She shared a small apartment on Clinton Avenue with her roommate, Patricia Valdez, who worked at the same company. That Friday evening, Jennifer had plans. She'd told Patricia she was meeting someone for dinner at Morrison's Cafeteria on Memorial Parkway, one of the popular spots where young professionals gathered. She'd seemed excited, maybe a little nervous, as she applied her makeup carefully in their bathroom mirror. When Patricia asked who she was meeting, Jennifer had been oddly vague. "Just someone from work," she'd said, adjusting the collar of her floral print dress. "I'll probably be back by 10. Patricia remembered watching from the window as Jennifer climbed into her powder blue Ford Pinto and drove away, the evening sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. That image, frozen in time, would haunt Patricia for the rest of her life, because Jennifer Hayes never came home that night. She never came home at all. When Jennifer didn't return by midnight, Patricia felt the first flutter of worry. By 2 in the morning, that worry had transformed into cold fear. She called Morrison's Cafeteria, but they had closed hours ago. She called the hospital, the police, anyone she could think of. The Huntsville Police Department took her report, but in 1978, an adult missing for a few hours wasn't cause for immediate alarm. People had disagreements, stayed out late, made impulsive decisions. Give it 24 hours, they said. But Patricia knew. Some instinct deep in her gut told her something was terribly wrong. The next morning, a Saturday, a groundskeeper at Monte Sano State Park made a discovery that would transform Jennifer's disappearance into something far more sinister. High up on the mountain, along one of the winding trails that offered breathtaking views of the Tennessee Valley, he found Jennifer's powder blue Pinto. The car sat in a small pull-out area, its doors locked, no visible signs of damage or struggle. Inside, Jennifer's purse remained on the passenger seat, her wallet intact with $43 still inside. Her keys dangled from the ignition, but Jennifer was nowhere to be found. The location immediately struck investigators as strange. Monte Sano Mountain, rising 1,640 feet above Huntsville, was a popular spot for hikers and nature lovers, but the area where the car was found was remote, accessed accessed by a narrow, unpaved road that few people knew about. It certainly wasn't somewhere Jennifer would have driven on her way to or from Morrison's cafeteria. Someone had brought her car there. But why? And where was Jennifer? Detective Robert Carmichael caught the case. At 41, he was one of the department's most experienced investigators, a Korea War veteran with a methodical approach and an instinct for reading people. As he stood beside Jennifer's abandoned car that Saturday morning, the June sun already beating down mercilessly, he felt the weight of what was to come. The purse, the money, the keys, everything pointed to something that made his stomach turn. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a car theft. This was something much darker. The search began immediately. Dozens of volunteers joined police and park rangers in combing Monte Sano's dense woods. The mountain's terrain was unforgiving, thick with oak and hickory trees, limestone outcroppings, and steep ravines choked with undergrowth. Search dogs tracked scents that led nowhere, circling back on themselves in confusing patterns. Helicopters flew overhead, their rotors echoing through the valleys. Days turned into a week, then two. The summer heat was relentless, the humidity making every breath an effort. But Jennifer Hayes had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. Detective Carmichael threw himself into the investigation with an intensity that worried his wife. He interviewed everyone who knew Jennifer, creating a detailed picture of her life in Huntsville. She had been well liked at work, punctual, professional. She'd joined a young professionals group at First Baptist Church downtown. She took night classes at Alabama A&M, working toward a business degree. She called her parents in Mississippi every Sunday evening without fail. The last call to her parents had been the Sunday before she disappeared. Her mother, Dorothy Hayes, recounted the conversation through tears. Jennifer had sounded happy, maybe a little distracted. She'd mentioned that things at work were going well. She'd hinted at meeting someone special, but hadn't wanted to give details yet. "You know how she was," Dorothy said, her voice breaking. "She liked to keep things private until she was sure." Boy, that mystery person became the focus of the investigation. Who was Jennifer meeting that Friday night? Patricia couldn't provide a name. Jennifer's co-workers were interviewed one by one, but no one admitted to having dinner plans with her. The staff at Morrison's cafeteria couldn't remember seeing her that evening, though they served hundreds of customers, and the Friday dinner rush was always chaotic. Detective Carmichael obtained Jennifer's work records, phone bills, everything he could find. In 1978, before cell phones and digital footprints, tracking someone's social connections was painstakingly slow work. He discovered that Jennifer had made several calls in the weeks before her disappearance to a number that turned out to belong to a payphone near Big Spring Park downtown. Dead end. Payphones were everywhere, used by everyone, impossible to trace. The case began to take on an eerie quality. It was as if Jennifer had been meeting a ghost. 3 months after Jennifer's disappearance, on a cool September morning, a hiker stumbled upon something that answered some questions while opening up horrifying new ones. Deep in a ravine on the north side of Monte Sano, obscured by summer's thick vegetation and nearly invisible from any trail, human remains were discovered. The location was more than 2 miles from where Jennifer's car had been found, in an area so remote that the hiker who found the remains had been off-trail, looking for a lost dog. The remains were badly decomposed, ravaged by time, weather, and wildlife. But dental records confirmed what everyone had already feared. They belonged to Jennifer Hayes. The coroner's report revealed what Detective Carmichael had suspected from the beginning. Jennifer had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of her skull. She had not died by accident or by her own hand. Someone had ended her life, then brought her to this remote location, hoping she would never be found. The news devastated Huntsville. This wasn't supposed to happen in their city. Huntsville was a place where people moved for fresh starts and bright futures, not where young women met tragic fates. Vigils were held. Jennifer's parents came to town for a memorial service that packed First Baptist Church to capacity. The local newspaper, the Huntsville Times, ran daily updates on the investigation. But as autumn turned to winter, the leads dried up. Despite Detective Carmichael's best efforts, despite hundreds of interviews and thousands of hours of police work, they couldn't identify Jennifer's companion that night. They had no witnesses who saw her at Morrison's. They had no forensic evidence that could be processed with 1978 technology. They had a victim, a cause, and a location, but they had no suspect. The case went cold. Detective Carmichael retired in 1989, 11 years after Jennifer's tragic end. The unsolved case, a burden he carried into his retirement. He kept a copy of the case file at home, reviewing it periodically, hoping some detail he'd missed would suddenly make sense. It never did. He passed away in 2003, never knowing who had taken Jennifer Hayes from the world. For 45 years, the case file sat in the Huntsville Police Department's cold case archive. Jennifer's story became local legend, the kind of cautionary tale mothers told daughters about being careful who you trust. Her parents passed away without answers. Patricia Valdez moved away in the 1980s, unable to live in the city where her friend had disappeared. The case was featured periodically in true crime articles and local history pieces, but no new information ever surfaced. Until 2020, Detective Sarah Brennan had joined the Huntsville Police Department in 2001, drawn to law enforcement by a childhood fascination with solving puzzles. She'd worked her way up from patrol to detective, earning a reputation for her tenacity and attention to detail. In 2020, when the department received a grant to review cold cases using modern forensic techniques, she volunteered to lead the initiative. The Jennifer Hayes case was one of the first she pulled from the archives. Reading through Detective Carmichael's meticulous notes, Sarah felt a connection to the long-dead investigator. She could sense his frustration in the margins, his careful documentation of every lead, every interview, every dead end. But she also had something he'd never had: access to DNA analysis, digital databases, and forensic techniques that would have seemed like science fiction in 1978. The original evidence had been carefully preserved. Jennifer's clothing, samples collected from beneath her fingernails, trace evidence from her car, all of it had been cataloged and stored. In March 2020, Sarah sent everything to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences with a request for complete DNA analysis. Then came the pandemic, and everything slowed to a crawl. Months stretched into a year, then two. Sarah called the lab regularly, checking on progress. They were backlogged, understaffed, doing their best. She understood, but the waiting gnawed at her. Finally, in January 2023, she received a call that changed everything. The lab had successfully extracted DNA from skin cells found under Jennifer's fingernails. She had fought her attacker, clawed at them, and in doing so, she had preserved the evidence that would eventually identify them. The DNA profile had been entered into CAUDIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, searching for matches against convicted offenders and arrestees. No match. Sarah's heart had sunk. But then the forensic scientist on the phone continued. They'd also run the profile through GED Match, a genealogical database where people voluntarily upload their DNA results to find relatives and build family trees. This approach had revolutionized cold case investigations in recent years, helping solve decades-old cases by identifying suspects through their family members. They'd found a match, a third cousin who'd uploaded their DNA while researching their family history. Over the next 2 months, Sarah worked with a forensic genealogist to build a family tree, carefully tracing the shared ancestors forward through generations, identifying potential suspects who would have been in Huntsville in 1978. The work was painstaking, requiring verification of births, deaths, marriages, and locations spanning a century. The tree eventually narrowed to 3 possible suspects, all men who had been living in the Huntsville area in 1978. 2 had since passed away. The third was still alive, 71 years old, still living in the same house on Weatherly Road that he'd purchased in 1975. His name was Thomas Edwin Pritchard. Sarah spent weeks investigating Thomas Pritchard's background, building her case carefully before taking any action. What she discovered made her blood run cold. In 1978, Thomas Pritchard had been 26 years old, working as a draftsman at the same aerospace contractor where Jennifer Hayes was employed. They had worked in the same building, though in different departments. He would have known her, at least by sight. He would have had access to the same cafeteria where employees ate lunch, the same parking lots, the same social circles. In the 45 years since Jennifer's disappearance, Thomas Pritchard had lived what appeared to be an exemplary life. He'd married in 1981, had 3 children, all now grown with families of their own. He'd coached youth baseball for 20 years. He volunteered at his church, leading the men's Bible study group. He'd been named Huntsville Citizen of the Year in 2005 for his charity work. He was the guy neighbors called when they needed help fixing something. He was the grandfather who never missed his grandchildren's recitals. He was, by all appearances, the last person anyone would suspect of such a horrific act. But Sarah knew that appearances could be deceiving. Monsters rarely look like monsters. They look like everyone else, hiding in plain sight behind smiles and good deeds, their secrets buried deep. She needed more than genealogical DNA to make an arrest. Alabama law required more direct evidence, so she began surveillance, carefully documenting Pritchard's routines, waiting for an opportunity to obtain a direct DNA sample legally. The opportunity came on a Tuesday afternoon at a coffee shop on University Drive. Sarah watched through the window as Thomas Pritchard sat at a corner table, drinking a large coffee and reading the newspaper. When he left, throwing his cup in the trash on his way out, Sarah waited exactly 15 minutes before entering. She retrieved the cup, now evidence, carefully bagging it according to protocol. The DNA from the coffee cup was rushed to the lab. The comparison took 3 days that felt like 3 years. When the results came back, they were unambiguous. The DNA from the cup matched the DNA found under Jennifer Hayes's fingernails. Thomas Pritchard was the man who had ended Jennifer's life 45 years ago. Sarah faced a decision. She could bring Pritchard in for questioning, but after 4.5 decades, she doubted he would confess. She could arrest him immediately, but she wanted to understand more. How had he done it? Why? What had Jennifer discovered that had sealed her fate? She went back through the original case files with new eyes, now knowing who she was looking for, and there, in Detective Carmichael's interview notes, was a detail that suddenly took on new significance. On June 26, 1978, 3 days after Jennifer's disappearance, Carmichael had interviewed all of Jennifer's male co-workers. Thomas Pritchard had been among them. His interview was brief. He said he knew Jennifer only in passing, hadn't had any significant interactions with her, had been home with his girlfriend the night she disappeared. The girlfriend, Sharon Mills, who later became his wife, had confirmed his alibi. But something about that interview bothered Sarah. She tracked down Sharon Pritchard, now Sharon Chen, after a divorce and remarriage in 2008. She was living in Florida, running a small art gallery in Sarasota. Sarah called her, introducing herself and explaining that she was investigating Jennifer Hayes's disappearance. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long that Sarah thought the connection had dropped. "I wondered when someone would call about that," Sharon finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. What Sharon revealed in that phone call painted a picture of a relationship built on fear and lies. In 1978, she had been 21 years old, working as a waitress, dating Thomas Pritchard for about 6 months. When Jennifer Hayes disappeared and the police came asking questions, Thomas had told her exactly what to say. He'd been with her that night. They'd been together at his apartment. She needed to confirm it. Sharon had been afraid to question why he needed an alibi. Thomas had a temper, she explained. He'd never been physically violent with her at that point, but there was something in his eyes sometimes, something that made her afraid of what he might be capable of. So she'd lied to the police. She'd confirmed his alibi, and the detective had moved on. Over the years, her guilt had grown. She'd married Thomas in 1981, partly out of love, partly out of fear of what he knew she'd done. She'd been an accessory to his deception, and that knowledge bound them together as surely as any wedding vow. The marriage had been troubled from the start. Thomas was controlling, prone to rages that terrified her, though he was careful never to leave marks where others could see. She'd finally found the courage to leave him in 2008, after their youngest child graduated from college. "Did you ever suspect him?" Sarah asked carefully. "Did you ever think he might have been involved in what happened to Jennifer?" Another long silence. Then, "I tried not to think about it, but yes, especially after I found the newspaper clipping." Sarah's pulse quickened. What newspaper clipping? In 1992, Sharon had been looking for their tax records in Thomas's office, a room in their house that she was generally forbidden from entering. In a locked drawer in his desk, she'd found a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Huntsville Times, dated June 1979, 1 year after Jennifer's disappearance. It was a memorial article about Jennifer, featuring her photograph and details about the ongoing investigation. He had kept it all those years, locked away where no one would find it. Sharon had carefully replaced the clipping. never mentioning it, trying to convince herself it meant nothing. But she knew. On some level, she had always known. With Sharon's statement recanting her 1978 alibi combined with the DNA evidence, Sarah had everything she needed. On March 13, 2023, a grand jury indicted Thomas Edwin Pritchard for the unlawful ending of Jennifer Hayes' life, which brought us to that misty March morning with Detective Sarah Brennan sitting in her vehicle outside the house on Weatherly Road, preparing to arrest a man who had hidden his true nature for 45 years. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic. Thomas Pritchard answered the door in his bathrobe, his thin gray hair uncombed, looking like any other elderly man starting his day. When Sarah showed him the warrant, his face went completely blank, void of any emotion. He didn't ask what it was about. He didn't protest his innocence. He simply nodded, asked if he could get dressed, and complied with every instruction. It was only as they were putting him in the back of the police car that something flickered across his face. Sarah caught it in that moment, a glimpse of the man he'd kept hidden all these years, cold, calculating, utterly without remorse. The news of Thomas Pritchard's arrest exploded through Huntsville like a bomb. The beloved community volunteer, the Little League coach, the grandfather everyone admired, arrested for a crime committed before most current residents had even moved to the city. Social media erupted with disbelief, denial, and slowly horrible acceptance. His children released a statement saying they stood by their father and believed in his innocence. His ex-wife Sharon released her own statement, brief and devastating. "I should have told the truth in 1978. I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. I hope this brings some closure to Jennifer's family." But Jennifer's family was long gone. Her parents had passed away in the 1990s. She had no siblings. The only person left who remembered her as anything more than a case file was Patricia Valdez, her old roommate. Sarah tracked Patricia down in Oregon, where she'd built a quiet life as a librarian. Now 68 years old, Patricia broke down when she heard the news. "I always knew something happened to her," she said through tears. "I just never knew who. And to think it was someone from her own workplace, someone she probably said hello to in the hallways." As the investigation continued, more details emerged. Police obtained a warrant to search Pritchard's home. In the same locked drawer where Sharon had found the newspaper clipping years before, they discovered a small gold locket that had belonged to Jennifer. It had been listed in the missing persons report as something she frequently wore. Pritchard had kept it all these years, a trophy from his crime. They also found journals, meticulously kept, dating back to the 1970s. Reading them, Sarah felt sick. The entries revealed a man who viewed women as objects, who felt entitled to their attention, who seethed with rage when rejected. In an entry from June 1978, written days after Jennifer's disappearance, he'd written about feeling cleansed and powerful. The picture that emerged was of a man who had asked Jennifer out, possibly multiple times, and had been rejected. On that June evening in 1978, he had either convinced her to meet him under false pretenses or had simply followed her. The evidence suggested he'd intercepted her before she reached Morrison's cafeteria, convinced her to drive up to Monte Sano to talk, then attacked her when they were alone. He'd staged the scene to look like she'd driven there herself, had hidden her body where he thought it would never be found, then had gone home to his girlfriend, who had provided him with an alibi without even knowing what she was covering up. For 45 years, he'd lived free while Jennifer's family suffered without answers. For 45 years, he'd played the role of an upstanding citizen while knowing what he'd done. For 45 years, he'd slept soundly while Jennifer Hayes lay in an unmarked grave, forgotten by everyone except the detective who'd tried so hard to find her attacker. The trial began in October 2023, 7 months after Pritchard's arrest. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA, the recanted alibi, the locket, the journals. The prosecution painted a picture of a dangerous man who had hidden in plain sight for decades, protected by time and his own carefully constructed facade. The defense argued that the DNA could have been transferred innocently, that the journals were just dark thoughts that everyone had, that the locket could have been acquired in any number of ways, but their arguments felt hollow in the face of the evidence. Thomas Pritchard never took the stand. He sat at the defense table, his face an impassive mask, showing knowing nothing of what he was thinking or feeling. His children attended every day, sitting behind him, their faith visibly crumbling as the evidence mounted. On October 27, 2023, the jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning a verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. Thomas Pritchard showed no reaction, but as the bailiffs led him away, Sarah saw him glance back at his children one last time, and in that glance she saw something that made her understand the true horror of what he'd done. He wasn't sorry for ending Jennifer's life. He was sorry for being caught, sorry that his carefully constructed life was finally falling apart, sorry that the mask had slipped and everyone could see the monster underneath. In December 2023, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 71 years old, it was effectively a sentence that would end only with his passing. The case that had haunted Huntsville for 45 years was finally closed. Sarah Brennan stood in her office on a cold January morning in 2024, looking at the case file one last time before officially closing it. She thought about Detective Carmichael, who had worked this case with such dedication but had never lived to see it solved. She thought about Jennifer Hayes, who had been just 23 years old, her whole life ahead of her, cut down by a man who couldn't accept rejection. She thought about all the years Jennifer's family had suffered without answers. But mostly, she thought about the lesson in all of this, the truth that made her job both necessary and heartbreaking. Evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't wear a mask or lurk in shadows. Sometimes it looks like your neighbor, your co-worker, the friendly man who coaches Little League and leads Bible study. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the most normal, the most trustworthy, the most like us. Jennifer Hayes had trusted someone that June evening in 1978. Maybe it was because he was a co-worker, maybe because he seemed safe, familiar. That trust had cost her everything. The case file closed with a soft thump. Sarah filed it away in the Solved Cases archive, where it would remain as a testament to justice delayed but not denied. As she left her office that evening, she thought about all the other cold cases still waiting for their moment, all the other families still hoping for answers. Technology had given them new tools: DNA databases, genealogical research, advanced forensics. But the most important tool she'd learned was persistence, the refusal to let time bury the truth, the commitment to keep searching, keep questioning, keep fighting for victims who could no longer fight for themselves. Huntsville had learned a hard lesson in 2023. They'd learned that the passage of time doesn't erase crimes, it only postpones justice. They'd learned that the people they thought they knew might be strangers wearing familiar faces. They'd learned that trust must be earned, not freely given, and that even the most careful facade eventually cracks. But most importantly, they'd learned that Jennifer Hayes had not been forgotten, that her life mattered. The truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge, will eventually find its way to the light. On a hillside in Maple Hill Cemetery, a new headstone was placed on Jennifer's grave in the spring of 2024. Her original marker had been simple, bearing only her name and dates. The new one, paid for by donations from the Huntsville community, read, Jennifer Marie Hayes, July 14, 1954, June 23, 1978, beloved daughter and friend, gone but never forgotten justice at last. Patricia Valdez flew in from Oregon for the dedication ceremony. She stood at the grave with Sarah Brennan, two women separated by generations but connected by the young woman who had brought them together across the decades. She would have done amazing things, Patricia said quietly, placing a bouquet of roses on the grave. She had so many dreams. She still did something amazing, Sarah replied. She left evidence that eventually caught her attacker. Even in her last moments, she was fighting. She made sure he couldn't get away forever. The sun broke through the clouds as they stood there, casting light across the cemetery. Somewhere in the distance, a cardinal sang, its clear notes cutting through the morning air. Life continued, as it always does, moving forward, even as we pause to remember those who can't move forward with us. Thomas Pritchard sits in a maximum security prison, his days measured in routine and regret. Not regret for what he did, perhaps, but regret for a life carefully built and violently dismantled. His children no longer visit. His grandchildren have been told he's gone. The name Pritchard once associated with community service and charity, is now associated with something far darker. And in Huntsville, life goes on. The city continues to grow, to change, to evolve. New families move in, drawn by the same aerospace industry that attracted Jennifer Hayes all those years ago. They buy houses, join churches, send their children to schools. Most of them will never know about the case that defined their city's darkest chapter. But Detective Sarah Brennan knows. She carries it with her, along with all the other cases she's worked, all the other victims she's fought for. And when she looks at the cold case files still waiting in the archives, she feels the weight of responsibility that comes with being a voice for the voiceless. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It's just justice waiting for its moment. And in a world where technology advances and determined investigators refuse to give up, that moment will eventually come. Jennifer Hayes waited 45 years for hers, but in the end, the truth emerged. The guilty were held accountable, and her story became a reminder that no matter how much time passes, no matter how carefully someone hides their crimes, no matter how perfect their disguise, justice has a long memory, and it never stops searching. The story of Jennifer Hayes and Thomas Pritchard teaches us something vital about the world we live in. It teaches us to be cautious without being paranoid, trusting without being naive. It teaches us that evil is not always obvious, that monsters sometimes wear the faces of neighbors and friends. It teaches us to listen to our instincts, to take seriously those small warnings that we sometimes dismiss. But most importantly, it teaches us that giving up is never an option. That fighting for truth and justice, even when the odds seem impossible, even when decades have passed, even when everyone else has moved on, is always worth it. Because somewhere, someone is waiting for answers. Someone is hoping that they haven't been forgotten. Someone needs to know that their life mattered, that their loss meant something, that their story didn't end in silence and obscurity. Jennifer Hayes' story didn't end in that ravine on Monte Sano Mountain in 1978. It ended in a courtroom in 2023 with the word guilty finally spoken, with justice finally served, with truth finally emerging after 45 years of hiding. And that ultimately is what justice means. Not always swift, not always easy, but persistent, inevitable, unwavering. The cold case that shocked Huntsville is now a closed case, but the lessons it teaches will echo through that community and through every community where similar stories wait to be told for generations to come. Remember Jennifer Hayes. Remember that behind every case file is a real person with dreams and hopes and people who love them. Remember that time doesn't heal all wounds, but truth can. Remember that justice, no matter how long delayed, is always worth fighting for. And remember that in the end, the truth always finds a way to the surface, always.